And what is the panel's view of the meaning of this, and what implications would it have for China's future development? If you try to be brief and concise. And also linked to this is, of course, how should the entering of the president's thought of socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era be interpreted? So this goes to the whole panel. Who would like to start? Yeah, Laura?
I guess I'll start. And obviously I defer to our other panelists, especially our political experts, to clarify further. But when I heard this term, obviously, of a new era, it, for me, harkens back to, from a historical standpoint, this continuity that we spoke about earlier in moving from Mao Zedong really represented this first era. Then you had under Deng Xiaoping these massive, emblematic, epoch type of developments. And so Xi Jinping is kind of developing into the third era, so to speak. It is a new era, but it does provide a certain historical legitimacy all along the way. In terms of the contents of what that new era is meant to contain, certainly from the time that he's come into power, to office, we have seen this concept of a China dream, this idea of development, of providing essentially the platform, the foundation for people to rise up out of poverty throughout the entire country. And so I would say that's probably one of the major hallmarks for not just his time in office, but something that he wishes to carry into the future. And the hallmark of all of this is certainly going to be the Belt and Road Initiative. That's essentially something he's looking to carry out through multiple generations in the future, not just his own.
Now, the Belt and Road Initiative was mentioned. Maybe someone could explain it to the audience in 5 sentences. Christina, what are you?
The
Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes. Okay. The Belt and Road Initiative is basically the name of the super big infrastructure investments that China wants to do in its neighboring countries and all the way to Europe, Africa, but I think they also have like wonderful pictures of going all the way around the world, basically. And everything, I personally see it as a trademark. So if you can put any project under the Belt and Road Initiative, then you can push it through the bureaucracy really quickly. But it's a political and it is an economic and also foreign policy project. And I strongly believe that Xi Jinping did not wake up one morning and say, oh, I'm going to do the Belt and Road Initiative, because this has been going on for a long, long time, even before he came into power.
Thank you. Coming back to the new era issue, which we started off with. Oscar?
Mm-hmm. Well, the new era, I'd rather comment on the socialism and Chinese characteristics. I mean, this is of course not a new concept in China. It's been used for a long time. And I would say that naming is a part of, the important part here is for Xi Jinping to have his ideas enshrined in the constitution. The meaning of it, I think at this stage is difficult to know, because this is a process that all Chinese leaders are doing. They name the theory or the ideas of their era, and usually it takes a long time before we actually realize what's in this. So, for example, the 3 representatives of Jiangxi, I mean, nobody knew what that was when it was launched. It just sounded really strange, but it turned out to be some kind of legitimation of a change of the Communist Party representing, you know, the elite more, and not only be a traditional revolutionary party. And that was a very important change that China was making, and the Communist Party, and to introduce private entrepreneurs into the party, for example. So that, but we didn't know that at the time when that idea was presented. I think it's the same with this. Of course we can speculate what it means, but it's basically a way to legitimize the policy that Xi Jinping is pursuing.
Do you agree with that?
Yes,
Christina?
I agree. I'm also thinking of the new era of China being a bigger global player that the West has to learn how to handle. Because Xi Jinping also talked in his speech about how China would be a role model for other developing countries, how to create economic growth without having to go down this horrible way of becoming a democratic country and abiding to, I mean, many Western countries are asking that we give foreign aid to them, but we do it on certain conditions. Whereas China is not going that way. They are only in it for the business, they are in it for the development per se, not to create to project liberal views as we do in Sweden, for example. And I think that this is something that we should all think about really a lot, because this is kind of worrying, because we are used to live in a world where the liberal democratic values are the ones that we are putting forward, whereas China does not have, even if Xi Jinping is talking about democratic values and human rights and so on, he does not have the same connotation as we have in the West. He talks with me. It's the same words, but it's different. It's something else behind the words. And I think this is something that could actually alter the world, the global order, eventually, because if we're talking about that China will work in the UN, for example, and they're proposing working democratically in the UN. Well, we have one vote, one country, but what if the majority of the countries are dictatorships and not pro-democratic values? Then that could be kind of an interesting future for us, so to say.
Well, that question itself would merit a separate panel.
Yes.
Definitely. Mr. Lee, would you like to comment briefly on what the other panelists, your colleague panelists, have said?
Maybe we can understand the new era in another way. Just like a long march, we are crossing many mountains, and we have our different goals. Now the new era is that as for the two centenary goals, now it's within reach. With our, in the past, we have the goal things far away. But from now on, it's just within reach, just like in the last stride, then you can reach the goal. So in this special period, that's the dawn of the realization of the centenary goals. This is the new period, the new era. But some people say the dawn of a day is the darkest time. And in other means, maybe the last stop is most difficult. We have to concentrate and work more hard. And we need a powerful central government, and we need the party to unite and lead the people to fight more harder. This is the new era. As for I agree with her. Of course, when we speak about democracy, human rights, we have different connotations. For example, we think the human rights not only includes political, social rights, but also economic rights. And for us, we think that especially for the developing people, for them, the most urgent need is the improvement of their living standard. Some people even do not have enough to eat, do not have enough clothes to wear. So that's why when we have development cooperations with other developing countries to realize the 2030 goal, we focus more on the local people's real needs. As for what kind of democratic model they will take, that is their choice. That is their internal affairs. We do not interfere.
But surely it would help if you have the same interpretation or close to one another what the concepts entails. Is that too much to ask?
I agree with that. The many question is that it seems to me usually the strong want to impose their will on others. I think this is not a democratic behavior. We should reach a consensus.
Which maybe can be reached by exchanges and discussions and development of common understanding of the concept. Oscar, would you like to add something to this on what we discussed at the moment?
You mean the concepts,
Yeah.
those kind of... Yeah, well, I think it's a very interesting question. I think the word democracy, for example, is too broad to be used in this, because it's being used to define so many different things. And I think maybe we could be more specific when we talk about it. So what the Chinese criticize is the liberal democratic model, and then they say we have another kind of democracy in China. But I mean, from a Western perspective, that is kind of strange, because what it means essentially is that the Communist Party embodies the will of the people, and that is in essence democracy. But these are completely different things. So I think, I think actually what should be good is to define the Chinese governance model in a clearer way, not using these Western words that are being used. So instead of saying, well, we are striving to build democracy, because China is not striving to build democracy in the way that the Western world thinks of it generally, but they are building a governance model that might have a different kind of legitimacy, that might be working in a different way. So why use the word democracy? That's what I'm asking. And I think that China was going in a very interesting direction for a while. They were building a system with very limited but some political participation, a kind of consultative, I think that was the word used by the ambassador, the consultative democracy, where you use inputs from society to a large extent and to develop a kind of legitimate government, but not democracy in the liberal sense. But that's what I've been worrying about, that this model, this collective model, this consultative model has been more and more limited these 5 years under Xi Jinping. So, which is, I think, then is a danger for the Communist Party and for China to. That's what I'm not saying that China should become anyway in the West, the way that West is developing. But I don't see the sustainability of the model that is being built now, where there is less listening to the voices of the people, less room for civil society to act, more and more censorship from an already really limited model. So, yeah.
Let me say a few words about democracy.
A few words.
A few words. Democracy does not mean only ballots. If you say multi-party system and elections, voting, people going to the vote to vote, if this process means democracy, then in many developing countries they have this process. And when they adopt this process, they do not achieve better development. Usually, at the end of the election process, there will be problems. The loser will not go. The winner insists to get the power. As a result, there will be internal fights, civil wars. I'm not sure. We don't say Chinese model is the best, but the Chinese consultative democracy serves Chinese people better, and we are more competent to make more contribute Chinese wisdom to the good governance of our country, which is the better way.
Okay, thank you very much for that. But just as a moderator, one objection. I don't think that throwing the ballot and that the winner goes to government leads to internal fights all the time in Western democracies. I think it was a bit...
Sometimes.
Yeah, it happens, but rarely, I would say. Leave that aside. Let's change subject now a bit. There were elections recently in Japan, and North Korea was a major topic during these elections. how did the crisis in the Korean Peninsula appear in the party congress? Was it at all present? How is North Korea talked about in China?
Sure, I think it's an excellent question, and one I'll start off by taking on. When we get to the 19th Party Congress, it was not a topic within certainly Xi Jinping's speech, and then I think also within the larger discourse. Although it being such a heady topic of today, it's probably more between the lines, once again. But I think, and this is an area that I've been researching for about 20 years now, actually, when I was based in China as well, looking at how Chinese experts, officials, military, technical community are talking about the North Korean issue. And I defer, of course, to our panelists from China if I'm incorrect. But what is striking is that there seems to be a large disconnect between the official statements on denuclearization, of course, in support of denuclearization that you see coming out from within China and its leadership, and the discussion on the ground. And there is a logic or a recognition of the logic that underpins China's nuclear program, I think is very apparent. And this idea of pursuing nuclear weapons, that China actually, in terms of its own nuclear forces, actually went through its own period, right, where it was responding to nuclear coercion from Western powers, and particularly the United States, in the 1950s and 60s, and saw the necessity of having nuclear weapons to defend the country against these potential external incursions, and also to gain international recognition and respect. There's still a recognition of that, and I certainly hear that a good deal in China and among my Chinese colleagues. And we also saw, even within the Chinese context, they conducted their nuclear tests just before the final signing of the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And certainly when we look at what North Korea has been engaged in, it's not surprising that they saw this. They see themselves in a similar position where they need to accelerate their capabilities on the ground in terms of missile tests, nuclear tests, before the window closes, so to speak, whatever that window may be. So I think that when we have had discussions, and a number of my colleagues have within China roundtables, the majority of Chinese political, academic, and industry experts continue to emphasize that North Korea's nuclear weapons are here to stay. They don't anticipate that the country wants to denuclearize or even necessarily freeze. They get the fact that North Korea does not want to become the next case of Libya, Iraq, Ukraine, right, in terms of giving up its nuclear capabilities at whatever level they are, and then potentially having its internal political system overturned, as we saw in those cases. And I think there is a calculation that we often miss, perhaps in terms of Chinese interests. It's not necessarily in its interest for North Korea to achieve complete denuclearization. I make this argument, I realize it's kind of provocative, but there is an argument in terms of stability. If it leads to the direction of Libya and these other cases I mentioned, that's not in China's interest. Stability is ultimately in China's interest. So in that regard, I think that there's also the sense that, of course, this is all focused on the United States. They have just as much of a focus on the US presence in the region, which they're trying to limit. And moreover, on the point of sanctions, which is probably the last point, I think that there is this general read, which is similar to what you hear coming out of North Korea, that sanctions have not worked, are not likely to work in the future. And that's why China itself has been looking for other options. Those options being the freeze for freeze proposal, of course, that's not currently on the ground. But in terms of the long term, what we're seeing with denuclearization, I don't entirely buy into the fact that that is in China's interests and that that's something that it really even has thought through what that would look like in the future.
Do you agree with that?
Me? I think that was a perfect analysis.
Okay.
I have different opinion.
I'm sure you have, yeah. But I leave you to the last. Christina, do you have anything to add to Laura's analysis of the...
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree that...
So, 3 against 1. Now, Mr. Lee.
China is a newcomer. So,
A newcomer in what game?
I mean, in this game.
Okay.
The Secretary General Xi Jinping's report to the Congress is 30,000 Chinese characters long. It takes him 3.5 hours to deliver. So the report only concentrate on strategic